Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's rescheduled CVRP for Fleets webinar, Build Your Fleet Electrification Case with Ease. We're going to give people a couple more minutes before we hop in and start this webinar. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's rescheduled CVRP for Fleets webinar, Build Your Fleet Electrification Business Case with Ease. We're going to start in about, let's say, at 11:02, so give a couple more minutes for people to file in, and we'll kick off the webinar. All righty. Hello, everyone, again, and thank you for joining today's rescheduled CVRP for Fleets webinar, Build Your Fleet Electrification Business Case with Ease. We have a great webinar lined up for you today to help your organization build a business case for your decision makers to say yes to a transition to electric vehicles. We designed this webinar to be the first stepping stone to your EV fleet transition journey. While there are several factors to consider, today we'll focus on a few major deciding factors you should focus on and the tools that can help you plan a successful transition. We hope you find the free resources and tools useful, as well as the lessons learned from the City of Fremont to be insightful as you begin to think about your specific transition and approach. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our several partners that have contributed to making this an impactful and value-filled webinar to help the fleets of California and beyond go electric. Thank you to the City of Fremont, the San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition, the Southern California, or SCAG, Clean Cities Coalition, the Clean Energy Technology and Policy experts at Optimy, the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition, the San Joaquin Electric Vehicle Partnership, and the San Joaquin Valley Clean Cities Coalition, and last but not least, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Next slide. First, as some of you may have experienced last week, we'd like to apologize in advance for any technical difficulties or delays we may experience today, as working from home presents technical problems from time to time, as we all know. Next slide. And now for today's agenda. First, I'll start with a round of introductions, followed by an overview of the Clean Cities Network and the resources available to you. Next, we'll cover the CVRP for Fleets programs and the fleet resources available through cleanvehiclerebate.org. Next, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District will give an overview of their clean transportation goals. And then the City of Fremont will cover the highlights from their transition and the grant that helped them. Last but not least, the project team at Optimy will give us an overview of the free tool they designed with the City of Fremont called EVFleet.Tools. This will be a great resource for any of you fleet or sustainability managers looking to assess your fleet needs. And finally, we'll wrap up with a Q&A section to address any of your questions. Next slide. And now to introduce our panelists. My name is Tim Insalvis, Senior Project Coordinator focused on our fleet incentive programs here at the Center for Sustainable Energy. I am also the coordinator for the San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition, and I will be your moderator for today. Next up, we have CJ Noble, our dealership and fleet outreach coordinator for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project here at CSC, and he'll be giving us an overview of the CVRP for Fleet's programs and resources. Next, we have Jacob from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, who will touch on their clean transportation goals, followed by Rachel DeFranco, Sustainability Manager at the City of Fremont, who will give us an overview of their transition and the grant they received from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District that helped fund their transition. Last but not least, we have Sam Hill Crystal, Energy Program Manager at Optany, the clean energy consulting firm that helped the City of Fremont transition and create the free fleet resource, EVFleet.Tools. And next slide. Let's cover clean cities. So for those who don't know, the Clean Cities Coalition Network is comprised of over 100 regional coalitions funded by the U.S. Department of Energy's Vehicle Technologies Office. The goals of these coalitions is to provide technical assistance, resources, and online tools and data to help local stakeholders transition to alternative and renewable fuels and fuel-saving strategies. I would highly encourage anyone on this webinar to visit cleancities.energy.gov to find the contact information for your local coalition to support you through your transition. I'd also like to thank again the East Bay Clean Cities Coalition, the San Joaquin Valley Clean Cities Coalition, the SCAG, or Southern California Clean Cities Coalition, and the San Diego Regional Clean Cities Coalition for supporting this event. And now I'd like to pass it over to CJ Noble to give an overview of the Clean Vehicle Rebate projects and its fleet-specific incentive programs. Take it away, CJ.
Awesome, thanks so much, Tim. So like Tim said, my name is CJ Noble. I am a dealership and fleet outreach coordinator for the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. So jumping right in, once you've decided that you want to electrify your fleet, whether you're doing it for the betterment of your community's air or for the monumental savings you'll get from cutting gas out of the equation, building your business case for fleet electrification will be one of the first major steps you'll have to take. And although it can feel like a monstrous task from the get-go, using these free resources provided by both CVRP and EVFleet.Tools will help accelerate your electrification process and help to convince you and your decision makers that switching over to an electric fleet was always a no-brainer. Before we dive into City of Fremont's case study and do a demonstration of the EVFleet.Tools, I'd like to give a quick overview of the savings that you can receive from the CVRP, as well as the resources available to you through the Fleet Electrification Guide. So the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project supports California's goal to have 5 million EVs on the roads by 2030 and 250,000 electric charging stations by 2025. That rebate is not funded by taxpayer dollars. The funding actually comes from cap and trade dollars or carbon credits. The transportation sector is obviously the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, and of transportation, light-duty vehicles emit the most. So for us to meet our emissions reduction goals, it comes down to people transitioning their cars, and since EVs are considerably more expensive, the rebate is an effort to make them more accessible. Moving on to the next slide. For a customer or fleet purchasing or leasing a new CVRP eligible vehicle, they may apply for the standard rebate and receive $4,500 for fuel cell EVs, $2,000 for battery electric EVs, and $1,000 for plug-in hybrid EVs. All vehicles must be new when purchased or leased, and eligible vehicles must meet certain criteria to be eligible for the program. However, the easiest way to choose an eligible vehicle is if the make, model, and year are listed on our website, then that vehicle is in fact eligible for these rebates. You'll also notice along the bottom here that there is an additional $2,500 rebate available. That increased rebate is available for low to moderate income consumers and is added on top of the standard rebate. So on the fleet side of things, only public fleets with a domicile located within a disadvantaged community are eligible for those additional funds. For those interested, that map can be found on our website and will help you locate whether or not your domicile is located within a DAC. Moving on to the next slide. So CVRP for fleets is going to be divided up into 3 different categories, each with their own benefits and requirements. That first category is going to be public agencies, and that includes local governments and state entities. That category includes up to 30 rebates annually for those fleets, and those fleets can also receive rebates up to 18 months in advance, or reserve them rather. It just provides an opportunity to be able to plan things ahead a little bit more. The next fleet category is car sharing and rental fleets. These fleets are eligible for up to 20 rebates annually and are eligible for reduced ownership provisions. Bearing in mind that car sharing and rental fleets often have a shorter turnaround time than that 30-month minimum retention period for CVRP, this provision is just designed to allow that these fleet types can be rebated for vehicles for a shorter amount of time to make that happen. The final fleet category includes businesses, nonprofits, federal entities, and tribal communities, and these fleets are only eligible for 1 rebate per lifetime. Moving on to the guide. In an effort to help entities further streamline their transition to a cleaner fleet, the CVRP team worked diligently to create the CVRP Guide to Fleet Electrification. This guide was created to provide the first detailed and holistic go-to source for fleet electrification. What we're working towards here is to help managers efficiently transition to an EV fleet, to help decision makers understand the cost and health benefit opportunities, and to highlight the abundance of resources available, including great materials like EVFleet.Tools. And if you are a fleet, facility, energy, or sustainability manager, I've got great news because this guide was quite literally made for you. Although there are lots of individualized resources out there on fleet electrification, we really wanted to focus on establishing an all-inclusive reference to help with each stage of the electrification process. By combining the knowledge in the Guide to Fleet Electrification with the power of the EVFleet.Tools, you can take a holistic approach to your transition, assessing savings accumulated from vehicle charging and maintenance, as well as preparing to capture further savings from infrastructure incentives, charging optimization, and solar. Moving on to the next slide, we're going to look at benefits of electrifying your fleet. One of the first steps in building your business case is identifying the general benefits associated with electrifying your fleet. Not only does switching to clean energy fleets help you to meet your climate action plan and greenhouse gas reduction goals, but it also has a discernible impact on your local air quality, significantly reducing your contribution to local emissions. Additionally, since EVs have significantly lower maintenance and fuel costs, your entity will see a lower total cost of ownership, further improving your bottom line. And finally, by leading the charge in turning to green energy in your community, you're showcasing your expertise and encouraging your neighbors to do the same, further accelerating the adoption of EVs. The CVRP guide provides details on how to maximize these benefits, and as Sam and Rachel will demonstrate later, the EVFleet.Tools is an excellent resource in helping to provide a holistic look at the benefits your fleet will experience when going electric. Moving on to the next slide. In order to build your business case around what, when, where, and how you can electrify your fleet, you first have to move into assessing your current fleet to help optimize utility. To do that, you'll need to be able to answer questions like, should I swap out this vehicle for an EV? How do I right size and optimize my fleet? Can I establish a motor pool or shared vehicle program? And should I install devices and software to track usage and increase my optimization? I'll provide a little bit of a sneak peek at what's ahead by telling you the answer to most of these questions is going to be yes. This guide goes the extra mile in telling you how and when to efficiently make these changes by setting a baseline and collecting data on your fleet. As we'll demonstrate shortly, once you've compiled your fleet's vehicle characteristics and usage data into a simple Excel sheet, that information can be uploaded to show the opportunities to transition your vehicles through the Fleet Electrification Planning tool. Additionally, EVFleet.Tools offers a second resource that can help you to screen your existing infrastructure through the Facilities Screening tool to guide you in your infrastructure development efforts. These important steps in identifying the logistics of your transition will make the switch to EVs as smooth and cost-effective as possible. Moving on to the next slide. One of the easiest and most important selling points you'll need to make use of when building your business case is about the financial savings you accumulate from reductions to your total operating costs. By combining the details, links, and tips provided by the Guide to Fleet Electrification with the data curated for you and your fleet by resources provided by EVFleet.Tools, you can make an argument for going green that cannot be refused. Those savings detailed in both these resources can come from a variety of sources, including transportation fuel cost savings, reduced service and maintenance costs, rebates and incentives like the CVRP, and of course, low carbon fuel standard credits. Moving on to the appendix and other resources. Before I pass it off, I just want to point out the dozens of additional resources provided in this guide that can help you build your case. This appendix includes details and links to a variety of different resources, including additional EV, EVI, and utility incentives, load management companies, telematics companies, and many more resources, including, of course, EVFleet.Tools. This extensive list of resources will ensure that whatever barriers you encounter on your road to electrification, you have the information on who to call and how to move forward. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Tim.
Thank you, CJ, for that great overview of CVRP and the fleet guide. Like he mentioned, it was a holistic resource that we designed specifically for fleet and sustainability managers looking to electrify. So we compiled a lot of information and resources for you guys to do it in an efficient manner. So I highly suggest downloading it off our website when you get a chance. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jacob from the Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks for hosting this webinar, Tim and CJ, and for all your work in pulling together the guide. So my name is Jacob Zilkiewicz. I'm a climate advisor at the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. The Air District is the air regulator for the San Francisco Bay Area, and the objectives or the goals of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District are to protect the air, to improve air quality, improve public health, and to do our part to help solve the climate crisis that we're currently experiencing. And with regards to the transportation sector from a climate perspective, CJ mentioned some statistics, and as with the state of California, the Bay Area, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. So tailpipe emissions, we're looking at 40–45% of the regional emissions profile come from the tailpipe emissions of the transportation sector. If you consider the upstream emissions associated with refining the petroleum-based product, you're looking at more than 50%. So that's a significant, the largest chunk of the greenhouse gas emissions from our region, and that trend is similar statewide. So with that in mind, and knowing that we've got a lot of work to do to reduce the emissions in the transportation sector, we've established goals through our Clean Air Plan and agency-wide in terms of not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions through all different economic sectors to align with the state standards, so 40% below 1990 levels by 2030, and reaching 80% below 1990 levels by mid-century, but also focusing specifically on the transportation sector and establishing targets to electrify all segments of the transportation sector. And setting a target is noble and it's great, but naturally the next step is how do you follow through and how do you start implementing some of these actions. And so a part of the work that we've been doing is we've established a climate protection grant program where $4.5 million was allocated to work with public agencies throughout the Bay Area on looking at numerous different projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of these projects was the fleet electrification study with the City of Fremont and Rachel and her team. It's been a fantastic experience working with the City of Fremont and Sam and the team. There's so much learning that occurred, at least from our perspective, in terms of what's required to get a fleet electrification study done. What does it actually mean to have a shovel-ready project? What are the different aspects that are evaluated? And it's just been a pleasure to work with the team. I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to Rachel and Sam to go through some of the findings. So thank you for your time.
All right, thanks, Jacob. Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel DeFranco. I'm the Sustainability Manager with the City of Fremont, and I'm going to dig into some of the details of our fleet electrification study. So next slide, please. Just a little bit of background. This project was funded through a climate protection grant that was given to us by the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, and the purpose was really to help us think strategically about how we can achieve robust decarbonization across our fleet and our facilities. And then also, because this was funded out of a regional grant, to develop some tools and resources that could be utilized by other local governments in the Bay Area and beyond to be able to do similar analysis. And again, as Jacob mentioned, this grant and this project is really in support of the Air District's goals of reducing air pollution and the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview of what our project entailed. We spent the last year and a half plus through various phases of the project. So the first phase was to look at our overall fleet and identify which vehicles are ripe for electrification and come up with some recommendations. And then from there, look at the sites at which those vehicles are domiciled, and really dig into how much EV charging infrastructure would be necessary to support those EV fleet vehicles. And then, as we analyzed the EV charging infrastructure, really understanding what the needs are in terms of electrical capacity and the impact that could have to our utility bills, and then looking at distributed energy resources such as solar and storage to understand how we might be able to best support that additional load from the EV charging. So finally, the last phase is to really pull together these technology recommendations and specific site locations at which we want to do this electrification work. And throughout the entire process, we also held a working group where we met on a quarterly basis, and that working group represented local jurisdictions and people who are invested in EV vehicles across the region to develop tools that now we're going to be sharing with you all that are open source for you to be able to utilize. Next slide, please. One more slide. One more slide. Okay, there we go. So just a quick overview of the findings from our project. We found that about a third of our fleet vehicles are ripe for electrification based on vehicles that are currently available on the market, which alone will result in $3 million worth of savings when we look at the total cost of ownership of those vehicles. 90% of the vehicles that we analyzed had at least one EV option currently available that would satisfy 100% of the driving needs of those vehicles. There's often a fear of range anxiety, and we found that at least in a municipal fleet, that all of the EV options available would, more than meet the needs of the daily driving habits. With this electrification, we would achieve a 54% reduction in our fleet emissions by the year 2030, which aligns really well with our 55% goal of emissions reductions on a community scale by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2045. And that's only if the electrification is limited to the EVs that are currently on the market. We know that the market is changing rapidly and there are huge advances just on the horizon. Next slide, please. So this chart shows in the blue bars the total number of vehicles that are slated to be replaced based on our fleet replacement schedule. And then the orange bars represent, of those vehicles, how many could be fully electrified, again, based on vehicles that are currently available on the market. So you can see that we're talking about, well over 100 vehicles within the next few years alone. Next slide. This is a really important graph for anyone who deals with their finance manager. We were looking at what is the total cost of ownership of the EV vehicles compared to the conventional vehicles that we would be replacing them with. So not just the upfront cost of those vehicles, but then the operational costs, which includes not only the fueling, but also the maintenance, which is a huge piece of the total cost of ownership. So as you can see here, over the period of 2021 through 2040, we have over $3 million worth of savings by replacing those vehicles with EVs instead of internal combustion vehicles. And you can see in particular the massive amount of savings associated with the vehicles specifically in our police department. Next slide, please. This graph shows you the carbon emissions reductions that we can achieve. So the first, or the dotted line on the top, is just kind of business as usual reference emissions. And then the gold line shows us, based on that current technology available with EVs, how much emissions reductions we could achieve in the next handful of years. And you can see that, you know, by 2027, 2028, we're really achieving the vast majority of those emission reductions from the vehicles studied. If we were to, in addition to that, what we didn't include in the initial analysis was a number of our pickup trucks that are, you know, utilized for a variety of things, a lot of maintenance vehicles, and we know that there are electrification options, you know, coming soon for a lot of those pickup trucks. But even if we don't include electrification of those vehicles, and we look at some of the diesel vehicles that we could utilize renewable diesel, and then we can achieve even greater emissions reductions. And then if we were to assume that those vehicles where, you know, maybe we weren't going to replace them because we don't have vehicles on the market now, but 2 or 3 years from now, vehicles do become available. If we were to replace those as well, starting in 2022, 2023, then we could almost nearly zero out our emissions associated with our fleet by the mid 2030s. So I think that that's a huge, you know, impact when it comes to municipal emissions overall. Next slide, please. One of the things that, you know, we did next after analyzing the vehicles was really to dig into how do we support the EV charging. And so we looked at a detailed analysis of infrastructure needs and the distributed energy resources focused around 4 main facilities: our city's Development Services Center, where we house community development and public works engineering, and all of our permit operations; our maintenance center, obviously where, you know, all of our city maintenance vehicles are housed; our city hall, which has a lot of, you know, other operations, city manager's office, human resources, you know, there's pool vehicles that sit at that facility; and then our police complex, where a large number of vehicles are housed, and the police department alone has about 100 patrol vehicles that are a huge part of this analysis. So you can see, you know, between these 4 sites, the vehicles that could be replaced with electric represent about 55% of the fleet by the year 2030 and 63% by the year 2040. Next slide, please. So then we looked at what's the current load of these sites and what would we be adding in terms of energy consumption as we electrify these vehicles and start to plug them in and charge them. And you can see the orange bar at the top, you know, adds a substantial amount of load. You know, it's almost the same amount of load that we're seeing at our city hall and our development center, you know, before EV. So we really need to think about how to manage that load, because if we don't charge the vehicles in an appropriate way, we could start to experience some extreme demand charges. Next slide, please. This graph in particular is looking at the Development Services Center as sort of a proxy for what could happen with demand charges as we electrify vehicles. And so we looked at the couple of electric vehicles that we currently have at the Development Services Center and how they're plugged in and charged on, you know, a day-to-day basis, and then extrapolated that based on the assumptions we had for the amount of EVs that would be housed at the Development Services Center over the next 10 years. What would that mean in terms of adding to demand? And you can see the red bars here really spike demand in the middle of the day. Oop, we went up a couple slides ahead. One more back, please. Okay, and that is, you know, a huge amount of additional kW in demand that we need to mitigate. So next slide, please. So then we looked at some operational scenarios, and we looked at 3 different charging scenarios. The rotational charging was assuming if we had incorporated some plug-in EVs, those vehicles would need to be charging on a more regular basis because they only have a certain amount of battery capacity, so they'd be coming in and charging, you know, whenever they come back to the domicile location. Unmanaged charging was assuming, if we are charging the vehicles based on the duty cycles of those vehicles, what it would look like. And then the managed charging is really looking at if we had some active management of those EVs, what could that look like in terms of, best practices. Sorry, my cat is being noisy right now. And so if we were to, come up with ways to manage those vehicles with software, and also to look at, how to best bring in those vehicles and charge them with, the personnel that are operating these vehicles, how are we going to be able to levelize those demand charges as best as possible? Next slide. So you can see here, this is those 4 locations that I mentioned. Based on those different charging scenarios, you can see how many charging ports would be required for the amount of EVs that we're looking at through 2030. So in the managed charging scenario, we actually would be required to have the least amount of charging ports. And then what was recommended is kind of including a safety factor. So, assuming we might get a few more EVs, or in kind of the worst case scenario where more EVs are out during the day and need to come in and charge, having some additional backup ports for charging. So what ended up being recommended in the report is these last numbers in the gray bar that's highlighted by orange. Next slide. So at each site, we also looked at, because some of these sites already have solar and some don't, what would be the best way to set up the EV charging in terms of connecting to the grid or connecting to distributed energy resources. And so at the maintenance center and the police complex where we have existing solar, those solar PPAs are on an earlier NEM tariff that is very beneficial to the facility. And we found that, we didn't need to install any more solar. And what we would do is actually set up a separate meter for the EV charging on PG&E's preferred EV rate. And we would be able to get the lowest cost for charging at those sites. At the City Hall and Development Services Center, where we do not currently have solar, if we add solar, we would be on a different NEM tariff, which wouldn't be quite as beneficial in terms of total cost savings, but it would allow us to have additional savings with the EV charging load. So we would incorporate that load. We would install solar, but we would also separately meter the EV charging. Sorry, on the maintenance center and police complex, we would actually attach that to the building meter. I said that wrong. So, but you can see on the right-hand side here, the levelized cost of charging for each of those sites, and it varies because of the utility rates that we have and the solar rates that we have. Next slide, please. So, in terms of building a business case, it's really important to look at, your fleet project from a holistic perspective, and looking at, as I've highlighted, the way to incorporate existing or future distributed energy resources, looking at the cost that EV charging infrastructure might add to utility bills, and really thinking about what's the total cash flow going to look like from an operational perspective. And also, not just doing it on a site-by-site basis, but looking at an analysis across multiple sites and really aggregating that, because as you'll see in the next couple slides, it makes a huge difference site by site. And if we combine them all as one large project, we can have positive numbers, but if we only look at one site in particular, we might actually not be in the positive. Next slide, please. So when we looked at all 4 sites, and we looked at, the EVs, the charging infrastructure, the distributed energy resources that either exist or would be added, we found that, we would have a break-even point, right around the year 2031. And so, the cumulative cost benefit of the upfront investment versus the long-term savings would break even at that point. And that's, I think a really significant finding, that if we invest in this robust EV replacement sooner rather than later, we'll start to realize those savings as a city long-term. Next slide. If we look at it at a site-by-site basis, some of the sites didn't pencil individually, and the maintenance center is a prime example of that. Because we have so many pickup trucks at that site, And because the analysis of those pickup trucks for electrification right now is not as competitive as some of the other vehicles that we looked at, the upfront costs versus and the additional charging infrastructure versus long-term savings doesn't break even, for a very long period of time. But next slide. Next slide. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay, I thought I froze. But alternatively, okay, one back. Can we go one back, please? Okay. At the police complex, we found that we actually had the best economic situation where the cost of ownership, over time is going to break even by the year 2029, and we'll have substantial savings, over $3 million worth of savings before the year 2040, which is really important for the city of Fremont in terms of not just rebounding from the economy and the hits that we've had over the last year with COVID, but also looking long term at financial planning. Next slide, please. So in terms of recommended actions, the team has really said that one of the key things in the overall analysis is having enough data to look at when it comes to our vehicles from the beginning. And so we did have some telematic data for the team to take a look at, but it was only on certain vehicles and not on all of our vehicles. So some assumptions had to be made in terms of how those vehicles were driving on a day-to-day basis and what the proper replacement options would be. So if your fleet already has telematics or you're thinking about getting telematics, one of the biggest recommendations is to do that as soon as possible so that you have more data to work with to be able to come up with some really realistic calculations in terms of the savings that you would achieve with electrification. We also, City of Fremont, we have a couple different internal administrative regulations that kind of dictate what we do in terms of fleet purchasing. We have a vehicle policy and we have an environmentally preferable purchasing policy. So looking at those and thinking about ways that those could be modified to help change some of the internal processes and assumptions that we make when we're doing budgetary items is really important. Some other things that the team recommended to the City of Fremont was hiring an energy manager. I'm a sustainability manager. I oversee our climate action plan, but I don't work in public works maintenance. I'm not dealing with utility bills on a daily basis. And the folks that pay utility bills are not looking at them from this kind of perspective either. So thinking about somebody who could really fill that void would be super helpful in terms of realizing savings that are out there and that we have the potential. Also really looking at employee engagement to support energy management. So, city employees are not typically engaged in these kinds of discussions. So it'd be important to do some additional work there. When we're looking at solar in particular, it may not make sense to install battery right away, but we want to make sure that we're preparing for microgrids at a later basis. So some of the solar that we installed early on, obviously, we didn't have that in mind because microgrids were not really a reality yet. But as you look at new solar contracts, it's really important to think about having the microgrid ready opportunities there. And then finally, one of the things that is, huge when we're thinking about fleet electrification is now we have all these batteries on wheels. So we can deploy them to other sites if we have an emergency where we need power, those vehicles could be used as backup power. And so we want to think about vehicle to grid integration opportunities as much as possible. And this is really where vehicles are no longer vehicles, buildings are no longer buildings. They're both part of the same overall network of our energy infrastructure. So it's a really exciting time to be thinking about this stuff as well. Next slide. So next steps for us, we're looking at how to incorporate EV suitability into our existing replacement process. But, I think even more important is we're looking at, our capital improvement plan. And while we don't have funding for this entire fleet electrification process currently, we have put the project into our CIP as an unfunded project. And we're currently exploring opportunities for funding that might become available, especially as we look toward the federal government. At this point in time, they're looking at robust, amount of funding going into major infrastructure improvements across the entire nation. So there may be ways to tap into that and get support for our work there. And next slide. And with that, I'm going to be passing it over to Sam, who's going to talk about the tools that were developed as part of this project that are available for you to be able to utilize. So Sam, do you want to take this slide and then go from there?
Yep, sounds good. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Tim, and the whole CVRP team for organizing this. Happy to be here, and it's an exciting topic. Yeah, as Rachel mentioned and Tim mentioned, my name is Sam Hill-Crystal. I'm an energy program manager at Optiny, and I was the project lead for the consulting team that worked with Rachel and the City of Fremont on their analysis. And as Rachel mentioned at the beginning of her slides, that project really consisted of 2 tracks. So in parallel to Fremont's analysis, the consulting team in the city also ran a working group in the Bay Area and worked with a regional group of stakeholders to develop a set of resources around fleet electrification. And so these resources are all hosted on a website that we made called EVFleet.Tools. And so I'm going to provide an overview of what's available, and you can also see a summary of that on the slide here. And I'll walk through a couple of the tools in detail. But before I do that, I'd also just like to provide a bit more background on the resources. So EVFleet.Tools and specifically the capabilities and the design, sort of like the user experience, you could say, of the Excel-based analysis tools that are hosted on the website. Were created in collaboration with the stakeholders that I mentioned in the Bay Area. And the goal was to make something that was, complementary to other tools and products out there. It's really intended to provide, enough detail and flexibility to get you started on your fleet electrification, sort of, frame the opportunity available to your organization in a way that has enough detail for you to trust. But as Rachel was sort of summarizing, there are a lot of other considerations. And so there's certainly, we're not saying that this is a replacement for a detailed study, but we really wanted to help you get the ball rolling. And it also links to other resources available for fleet managers and sustainability staff. Fewer than what Tim has in their guide, but definitely some. And we really encourage folks to look at everything that's out there, because just as fast as the vehicle space is expanding, the resources to keep up with that are also expanding very quickly. Great. So now, if I could share my screen, if I have those capabilities. Awesome. Just give me 1 second here. Can you all see that? Awesome. Great. So this is the EVFleet.Tools website. Here's the URL. You can all navigate there at your leisure and check it out. And I'll summarize a couple of things that you can find here. The first thing I wanted to summarize is a best practices guide that we built, sort of based on the conclusions that we came to with the with the Fremont team. And these will give you sort of a range of more generalized conclusions that we hope sort of helps inform your own analysis. One thing to highlight here is electrification as a capital project. So Rachel touched on that, but that's sort of one highlight I think that came out of this that's very applicable across public agencies particularly. And we think that this framing is a way to sort of actually execute on some of the best practices that we've been highlighting as a way to build the business case. So if you want to approach a project across multiple facilities to capture all the savings like we outlined, framing it as a capital improvement project is a good way to actually execute that. We also you can click through here. There's a range of different topics to cover. There's also a lot of work around charging cost optimization, distributed energy resources. So one to highlight here in relation to the business case is this idea of the value of existing solar, which Rachel touched on briefly as well. But where your organizations have existing solar, that will often have a higher sort of relative value compared to solar that is being built and interconnected now. That's due to various regulatory changes to the NEM, net energy metering policies in California. So this graph is showing Fremont sites as an example, but you can see sort of how the value of solar changes over the years and depending on when the projects were built. So we really, that's one thing that sort of an easy low-hanging fruit. You can look at where you have existing solar and try to use that to really drive down the cost of charging, which will improve the total cost of ownership calculations, which is really the basis for this business case that we're talking about today. So definitely encourage you all to check out that best practices guide. Now I will cover two other resources that we have on here: the fleet planning tool and the facilities assessment tool. So I think taken in combination, these tools help address two aspects of the business case for fleet electrification. The fleet tool will help you get an understanding of those total cost of ownership savings associated with the vehicles. And then the facility tool helps you get an understanding of where it will be cost effective to build the required infrastructure, and whether those sites have potential to just for distributed energy resources. So unfortunately, with private infrastructure that you're using for your fleet, with the exception of a few rebates, those are really going to be a cost. So the question is, how do you maximize savings on the vehicle side to try to help pay down some of that infrastructure investment up front? So both of these tools are sort of organized in the same way. We have a welcome page, which you can see here, that sort of summarizes what all the steps are, gives you an idea of what you can expect, and then you can get started and you actually go into the tool, and it's organized so you have step-by-step instructions on the website, which you can come back to whenever you need. And then at a certain point, you'll be prompted to download an Excel file, and you can sort of do the analysis on your desktop, save it, whatever you need, while you follow along with the guide online. So we start with some framing questions to get your mind around all the problems that you'll be tackling. And then it'll take you through sort of a step-by-step process. So I will skip ahead here because we're a little short on time, but just show you what the Excel tool looks like. But I really encourage you all to use this and really read what's here, because we found it to be very useful in getting people going. So once you get to step 2.4, that's when you're prompted to download the tool. And so this is what it looks like, familiar Excel interface, and I'll just highlight a couple key tabs here. So the first is the fleet data template that you can see here. So you'll actually download this in one of the early steps as you go through as a standalone file, and that gives you the chance to really get your fleet data organized. As Rachel was alluding to, the data is a huge challenge for these analyses. It's sort of hard to understate the vast array of ways that organizations keep their data and manage it. And so, we've sort of broken that off and given folks a chance to really sit with that data on its own. And the idea is that once you fill out the template, you can paste it right onto this tab. I already have some sample data in here, but you can paste it right on and everything will calculate from there. And you also have sort of a clean data set that you can then, give to a consultant or use to track data moving forward to really improve your data management of your fleet. So once you get all your data set up, there's a parameters tab that you can set different assumptions around when you're replacing your vehicles, your gas costs, all that type of thing. There's some specific features that are specific to the Bay Area and Northern California because of how this was developed. So you can look specifically at PG&E's commercial charging rates for EVs and how those might change. And then, as because we're on the CVRP webinar, we wanted to highlight here that you can, include or not include the the value you can get from those incentives. So that's another option. You can make some assumptions around what your carbon emissions intensity of your electricity is. You can, put in all of your departments and that type of thing. And then that brings us to the dashboard, which is really where the outputs are. So you'll notice some similar graphics to what Rachel showed. These were projects were done, at the same time. So you have your emissions reductions, your vehicle replacement timeline, and then your sort of estimated total cost of ownership by facility and by department. And then you can also, filter things however you want, and isolate a certain department or whatever is useful for you when you're having your internal conversations. The final tab I wanted to look at here is the facilities output tab. So this tab is going to summarize your estimated daily energy requirement for each facility. And depending on what facility names you enter, this will change, and you can choose a different year. So you can look at, in different years, depending on where you are in your replacement timeline, sort of what those daily energy needs are. And that's one of the key outputs of the tool that really links the fleet tool with the facilities tool. And so you'll take from these cells and you'll actually use that as one of the key inputs into the facility screening tool, which I'll show you right now. But that's, an important feature of these is that these are meant to be done in a certain order so that you can, start with the vehicle analysis, move to the facilities analysis. So jumping over to the facilities analysis here, the facilities tool here, it looks very similar. You have that intro page, and then you have your step-by-step analysis that you can click through. We have a data template again, and some screenshots. Give you, this sort of helps you interpret your data, fill everything out, and the key thing I wanted to really highlight here is the outcomes. So the facilities tool is really a screening tool. So it's going to give you an idea of sort of which existing facilities are a good fit for EV infrastructure, which ones have enough electrical capacity to actually meet your needs without, an expensive upgrade to your switchgear or something like that. And then which ones are a good fit for solar and storage based on some data that you give us. So depending on those feasibility rankings and those sort of outcomes of the screen, you'll come to a couple of different conclusions. And so this page really helps you match those outcomes to a next step and think about, once you've completed this analysis in the fleet tool, once you've completed the analysis in the facilities tool, where are you going to go? Are you going to start procuring vehicles right away? Are you going to start procuring infrastructure right away? Do you need more of a study? That type of thing. And so, this is a useful sort of summary of where to go once you're done these analyses. So I will pause there. I know we're coming up on our Q&A time here. I did go through this fairly quickly. There's a lot here, so I'm happy to follow up with folks at any point. And we're continuing to refine these and provide support for new users and doing some beta testing. So encourage folks to reach out if there are specific questions or issues with these resources. So with that, I'll hand it back to Tim.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for that great overview of EVFleet.Tools. This is such a good free resource for fleet managers to start looking at, GHG reductions and total cost of ownership savings and even site assessments. So major thank you to the team, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, for funding and making this a free resource. Thank you, Rachel, for that great work you're doing over the City of Fremont. That case study was amazing. I think it really provided a lot of great insights for our viewers about electrification benefits, the huge savings, the backup resiliency opportunities, which is really big, but also the different strategies you need to consider on, depending on the site, utility costs, and vehicles. Everyone's going to have a unique strategy when it comes to approaching it. So like she mentioned, it's very important to look at this holistically and get started by discussing with major stakeholders, planning and collecting data as early as possible. And thank you again, Jacob, for speaking on behalf of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. This is a great example of how local stakeholders can really complement each other to reach their climate action plan goals. So I highly suggest, engaging with your local air districts, your energy providers, and related stakeholders, and get the conversation going about your electrification process. So thank you all, everybody. CJ, thanks for that great overview of CVRP for fleets. And now we'll open it up for Q&A. I think we have a couple questions in the chat. Let me just pull that up. All right. The first one's for you, Rachel. In your economic analysis, what did you assume about PG&E rates? Have you considered scenarios where you negotiate a particularly favorable rate just for Fremont electrification?
I would love it if PG&E would negotiate with us. Sam, do you want to talk a little bit about the assumptions that went into the rate analysis?
Yeah. So we looked at a couple different options for our analysis related to charging costs, as well as the sort of financial feasibility of DER, solar and storage. So we looked at existing PG&E rates that the buildings are on. So it's like the B10 rate, for example, and rates that are now reflecting that 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. peak period, which is creates some complications for EV charging. When electricity is most expensive is often when the vehicles are returning, if you're doing an unmanaged scenario. As we looked at that, and then we also looked at PG&E's electric vehicle specific rate, which is sort of what the question's referring to here. It's not specific for the city of Fremont, but for anyone doing electric vehicle charging, any commercial customer doing electric vehicle charging in PG&E's territory. That has a different way of doing demand charges, which is more favorable. And so, from Rachel's summary, you could see that when you had existing solar, it made sense to stick on the building meter and use the building rate. But in a lot of cases, with looking at new solar development, and it could potentially make sense to go on PG&E's rate and do a separately metered scenario just on that rate. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add, with having a separately metered EV rate, then you're pulling directly from grid energy. You're not pulling from on-site solar. So there is some, kind of real life GHG emissions associated with that, on a day-to-day basis, we might be able to capture better than if we're looking at it from an annual kind of GHG emissions analysis perspective. The other thing I'll add is, Fremont is a member of East Bay Community Energy, our CCA, in Alameda County and beyond. And EVCE has been very supportive of helping cities try to really realize our electrification goals, across both the building and transportation sectors. And so there's some conversations, really early stages that we're having with EVCE right now around what kind of support could they potentially offer to help us with fleet electrification as well. And I think that, any cities who are looking at this should really look toward their CCAs as a really key resource and partner here.
Oh, that was a great addition, Rachel. Definitely communicate with your CCAs and your IOUs. And each IOU has their different fleet programs, so they have different fleet incentives and rates and structures. So definitely connect with your IOUs and have those conversations. And connecting with the CCAs and plugging them into how we can work together is, that's how we're going to be successful in the future together. So thank you for that.
Another plug for EVFleet.Tools. We do have all of the working group meetings recorded up there, and we had a session specifically on the role of CCAs and PG&E specifically, being the Bay Area, in funding fleet electrification, both on the vehicle and the infrastructure side. And I think some of that discussion would be very applicable for folks, in other parts of California. So if folks are more interested in that, they can check it out on the website.
Awesome. Another reason to go visit EVFleet.Tools, guys. That's a great resource. I can't say it enough.
Salesman cap on it.
And it looks like we have one question for Jacob. Jacob, when you say the Bay Area fleet, were you referring to public and private sector fleets? I guess for your fleet goals.
Yeah, so I think the electrification goals. Yeah, I mean that was region wide. So I mean that's the transportation sector. You know the GHG numbers that I mentioned. That was for private, public, light duty, heavy duty. I mean it was the entire transportation sector that that I was talking about. For the 90% electrification, I believe that was for the light duty sector.
Gotcha. Thanks for that clarification. Are there any other questions? Check the chat one more time. I missed any. All right. Looks like we covered it all and with 1 minute to spare. So thank you all again for joining the webinar today. All of our contact information here is on this page. And again, we will be posting this webinar online for viewing later. Highly encourage everybody to reach out to us. We're here to support you guys in your electrification process. So and with that, I'll say thank you to all of our panelists again and partners and supporters. I wish you guys a great week and great rest of the week. Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.